From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Joe Biden says no to sending American F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine as the Internal Revenue Service releases more data on who pays most of America's income tax. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Kim Strassel. With a Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine still expected in the coming months, the free world is again talking about what weapon system to send to Ukraine's defenders. And this time it's fighter jets. President Biden was asked by a reporter on the White House lawn on Monday whether the U.S. was considering sending any F-16s, and he said simply, quote, no. But French President Emmanuel Macron is saying that nothing is excluded, cautioning that any French jets sent would have to be with a promise that they wouldn't touch Russian soil. Kate, what do you make of this latest debate over what systems to send to Ukraine? And what is the difference on the battlefield that some Western fighter jets would make? I mean, my understanding is that so far in this war, Russia has not been able to control the skies the way that some analysts suspected when Vladimir Putin first invaded.
Yeah, Kyle. So I think the way to read Biden's remark is the 8-ball is saying ask again later. One thing we've seen the Biden administration do pretty consistently on every weapon system for Ukraine, whether it's multiple launch rocket systems or Switchblade drones or Patriot missile defenses, is that they say no, they throw up reasons why it can't be done, and then eventually they walk those back and provide the weaponry. So I think we can expect a similar story to play out on Western fighter jets. Now, I think it's worth talking about what Western fighter jets might be useful for in the battlefield. I think that operationally, to your point, the Russian Air Force has just not been able to control the skies. They've been very timid. They've been unable to work closely with their ground units, which is essential. So there would be an opportunity, I think, for better fighter jets. The Ukrainians have some MiG-29s, and they have done some enterprising work with them. We have retrofitted anti-radiation missiles onto MiG-29s, and they have used them to great effect to go after Russian air defense radars. And also, we've definitely flooded their Air Force with spare parts for the MiGs to keep them up and running. So already they've been able to use their small old Air Force to great effect. So they may be able to do much more if they had Western fighter jets. One last thing, though, that we should think about is that we have said in our pages we should have started training F-16 pilots from Ukraine some time ago. The Ukrainians have been offering to send pilots somewhere to train to learn to fly the F-16. I think we first mentioned that in the print in April of last year. That's been an obvious thing we could get going on so that we'd have the option to sell them F-16s, but we haven't done that. So what we're talking about now is going to be a significant process to get them trained on the aircraft, to get a maintenance tail up where they can sustain the aircraft. These things do take time. So I think we need to look at jets as important as a signal of Western resolve to be in the war for the long haul. But we also need to talk more about what we can give the Ukrainians right now that can help them take advantage of this opening before the Russians get dug in.
To the point that Kate's making about whether the 8-ball is saying ask again later, Kim, I find myself wondering the same thing, because that has been the story of Americans in this war so far. I think that President Biden deserves credit for the material that the United States has sent for standing by Ukraine. On the other hand, it is always, it seems, later than it could have been. And there's a political story saying that Ukraine has identified a list of up to 50 pilots who are ready to start training on the F-16. These are seasoned pilots. They reportedly speak English. They have thousands of combat missions under their belts, according to this report. So it could maybe take 3 months to train them on the F-16. And yet Biden is saying no. Kim, I mean, do you suppose that means that he might say yes in 3 months? And if that's the case, if that's where the United States is at, it seems like it would be better to start that training now than later.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the sad thing, is that if he's going to get there in the end, let's just do it now. And as Kate was mentioning, this is what's happened with drones. It's what happened with HIMARS. It's what's happened with Patriots. It's what happened recently with tanks. The Ukrainians lay out their demands and we hem and haw. And in this case, though, I think one of the things that's concerning to me is that the waiting is more than just the United States not handing over F-16s, in that there's almost a parallel situation here to what recently happened in Germany, where Germany didn't want to hand over the tanks. and as a result held up the ability of other countries who had some of these German Leopard tanks, their ability to re-export them because they had to get German sign-off. Now we've got a similar situation here. It's not just that the United States is holding back on providing F-16s, but you have a number of European countries that are currently themselves upgrading at the moment to F-35 to Panthers. And so they have some F-16s that are going to be decommissioning, they're going to be moving away from, and that they'd be willing to send to Ukraine. But the United States needs to give its approval of re-export. So these are countries like the Netherlands and Germany and Finland. And so, yes, we need to be doing this now. We need to be moving now. We certainly need to be moving on the training, especially because if you could give a green light, there's also opportunities for some of these pilots. And as you said, the Ukrainians have a list of about 50 of them. A number of them have already also done joint training exercises with the United States, not necessarily flying F-16s, but doing simulations with them in the battlefield. And they would be able to come over, and there's also private companies that they could contract with and begin training. But nobody's going to do this until the United States has given a green light for this to all begin. So it would really be useful there's a push going on. There's some stories that have been leaking out about how military officials are really pushing for this within the administration. But obviously it does come down to the Biden administration. Also, one more thing, I don't buy, there's some arguments saying that this would be escalatory. And you cited Macron as saying that he wanted to put his own restrictions on how these could be used. If we were sending some of our latest aircraft, our F-22s, our F-35s maybe, but F-16s, it's hard to see how that could be viewed as escalatory.
Kate, a moment ago, you mentioned the importance of sending systems that could have more immediate effect in Ukraine. And I wonder if there's anything specific that you had in mind. And then also, just to pick up on the point that Kim made, I mean, my understanding is that President Biden's move to send these U.S. Abrams tanks is mostly a matter of appearances and giving cover to European allies to send their own tanks, because these Abrams tanks are not coming out of stocks. They're not going to be in Ukraine in the immediate near-term future. And so why couldn't we make a similar move with F-16s? To the point that Kim makes, there's some reporting that Dutch officials are saying that they could supply some F-16s to Kiev, but that requires U.S. approval and potentially a U.S. commitment to backfill those. There may be other allies like Poland that still have some MiG jets sitting around. And so I don't understand why President Biden couldn't take the same approach with these fighter aircraft as he did with the tanks, which is that the U.S. is going to say, yes, we'll send something, and it may take a while, we'll get some training going. But really, the point is to create a permission structure that allows these allies that are closer to Ukraine to get more immediate aircraft moving here.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things about that. I mean, the Ukrainians have really proved to be quick studies on every weapon system that we've given them, and I sincerely admire the enterprise of their pilots who just want to get in the jet and get learning. But we do think that it will take some time. The U.S. spends about $5 million on a basic qualified F-16 pilot. Obviously, we could condense some of that, but it is a large operation to train pilots, and that's why it's a pity we've waited so long to get going on it. But here's one thing I'm concerned about, Kyle. I'm concerned we are moving on some of these longer term weapons. And to your point about tanks, I mean, defense officials have said we're talking about 12 months maybe before those tanks are ready to go. Months, not weeks, is what they've been saying. And we know F-16s would require some time to get set up. So I'm worried that we might be focused on some of these weapons that we take a little bit longer to get into the field and that we're not putting enough energy into what we can do now. I think you need to do a both and approach. You need to help meet Ukraine's needs right now while also setting them up for what's going to be what appears to be a long fight. I mean, Putin is not backing down. He's mobilizing more troops. He's procuring more ammunition. So I think you need to do both now and later. And so on the front, what can we do now? I think the very obvious thing we could do now is supply them with the Army's tactical missile system. Now, what that is that it's a weapon that you can put in the rocket systems, the HIMARS, that they already have. They're using a different munition right now, but it doesn't have the same range as the Army's missile system, and it doesn't allow them to strike so deeply into Russian positions. They're called ATACMS, but I always try to say Army Tactical Missile System. I think those could make a big difference on the battlefield pretty quickly. But it's concerning, Kyle, because we've seen some news reports that the Biden administration might have gone as far as modifying the HIMARS so that they couldn't shoot the Army missile system, even if somebody else donated some. And we're not seeing the Biden administration move off that position the same way as we're seeing some leaks about F-16s. And so that concerns me that we're not focusing enough on things that could immediately improve the picture in Ukraine.
Well, Kim, let me pick up on that and the point that you made a minute ago about escalation. And on the F-16s, there's a quote floating around from an unnamed Department of Defense official. He says, quote, "Let's face it, a nuclear war isn't going to happen over F-16s," unquote. But what do you make of the statement that Emmanuel Macron made about if any fighter jets are transferred, it has to be with a promise not to touch any Russian territory? And this similar question about longer range missiles for the HIMARS systems. I understand the point that it's escalatory if Ukraine makes any strikes on Russian territory. On the other hand, Ukraine is trying to win a war after being invaded by an aggressive power.
Right. This has been one of the restrictions that essentially has been strapped on Ukraine since the beginning of this war, which is a problem. I mean, just think about it in this regard, that often Russia is doing a lot of resupplying of its lines from its own territory. The ability to go there and to potentially disrupt some of that could be really consequential in the course of the war. Now, I get the fact that all NATO countries are very concerned about their equipment, which they've been giving to the Ukrainians, potentially being used in such an offensive strike. But I think at some point, people are just going to have an honest conversation about that. And especially at a certain point, too, equipment becomes fungible, a little bit like money. Like, is it okay for the Ukrainians to take one of their MiG-29s and fly it over Russian soil, but not if it's an F-16? It's a little bit of an odd situation. Again, I understand the sensitivity, but I think that we need to have a very frank conversation about this if the goal is actually Ukraine winning this war. It might be worthwhile, too, because I think we didn't really kind of get into it, just explaining why these F-16s could be so important, because I think it goes to Kate's point about getting things to them in the immediate term and the longer term. The Ukrainians really have done a good job with their integrated air defenses of not letting Russia dominate the skies. But there's some concern that they are running out of some of the missiles that they are using to counter Russian missiles and drones. And one of the things about the F-16s is it provides them an air-to-air missile defense, which allows them to shoot down these missiles and drones and better protect their territory from some of these attacks that have been coming in from Russia. You can also move these, obviously, aircraft around a lot more quickly than you can with ground defenses like NASAMS or Patriot missiles. So there's some real reasons to do this. And just waiting doesn't seem to make any sense, in that if we hadn't had this attitude from the beginning on all of these things that the administration has dragged its feet on, who knows where things might be right now in Ukraine. Maybe this would be over. I mean, it's not certain, but waiting certainly isn't helping anybody.